Thank you, Madam Speaker. Colleagues, I support C-11, an act to amend the Broadcasting Act and to make related and consequential amendments to other acts. I thank all who have spoken on this bill's goals and complexities, which have come to the fore in this chamber and through the hundreds, no thousands, of emails we have received. Bill C-10, not completed before we rose in the summer, has become C-11, as Senator Dawson said, reflecting issues raised, especially those around user-generated content. It now strengthens protections on free speech. C-11 represents the first and long overdue Canadian Broadcasting Act overhaul since 1991. The world of broadcasting has been through a sea change since then, and modernization is absolutely necessary in today's world dominated by the internet and digital technology. Canadians now access digital platforms for much of their entertainment, Netflix being accessed by 62% of Canadian households. In 2019, that platform alone generated some $1 billion. That success story is well earned. But this digital shift created a significant imbalance. Online broadcasters are not required to support Canadian content like traditional broadcasters are. This is a major concern for Canada's arts and culture community. Bill C-11 seeks to redress this situation. The changes we're discussing today, for the most part, have come from the 97 recommendations of the Report on Broadcasting and Telecommunications Legislative Review Panel, which reported in 2020. Tasked to review the current situation, the panel's objective was to provide the government with recommendations to best modernize the Broadcasting Act in the digital age in the Canadian context. The purpose of this bill is to boost creative production, support arts and culture in Canada, and benefit millions of audiences. May we remember this goal as we study it. The three key desired, needed outcomes are artist payments, production monies, and discoverability. Simply put, Bill C-11 clarifies that online broadcasting is within the scope of the Broadcasting Act. The changes better reflect Indigenous persons with disabilities, and Canada's diversity. It underlines fair and equitable treatment between online and traditional broadcasters, introduces an administrative monetary penalties regime, and adds more explicit information sharing and confidentiality provisions. We must determine if these objectives are met. Key for me is that internet platforms will be regulated like broadcasters. This is very much supported by Canada's creators, for whom support for creation and for presentation is essential. The early internet was described as the information highway, and highways have rules and realities. Now, our living culture, the internet, presents the unique talents of Canadians.
Let me remind you again of our Canadian reality. The arts and culture industries are the third largest employer in Canada. They contribute significantly to our GDP, and yet the startling anomaly is that our artists represent the largest percentage of the working poor living below the poverty line. This needs to be corrected. I believe that they, like all other professionals, should be fairly compensated for their work and supported in developing new work. This bill takes that step.
During COVID, artists created and shared their work using means they had at their disposal, including cell phones and internet platforms. Musicians, writers, storytellers, and more gave us solace, inspiration, connections, and hope through the pandemic and other recent tragedies. They did so, earning nothing, as internet platforms don't pay. Indeed, a recent study showed that musicians who put their work on internet platforms during COVID earned an average of $67 per year. Who in this chamber could live on $67 per year, or even $67 a week? Canada's artists have supported and do support this country. Now Canada needs to support its creators fairly. This bill takes important steps for compensation to creators, producers, and arts communities. Colleagues, the arts are not a societal frill. As I frequently say, they are at the core of society, an anchor in myriad dimensions. They are not unimportant, they are essential. Au printemps dernier,
last spring, when I spoke to C-10, I took you back in history and pointed out the consistency of the guiding principles we have maintained nationally over the decades as successive new technologies have been developed. The broadcasting chapter of the 1951 Massey Report, 1941, chaired by the future Governor-General Vincent Massey, reveals some parallels with today's context.
Television is becoming an important and dangerous rival to other mass media and the cinema. The Massey Report debunked that perception, saying there is television broadcasting today in a number of countries. Each of these countries follows in television the same policies as in radio broadcasting. Colleagues, each update of the broadcasting regulations saw an increase in Canadian content in the 1950s, the 1980s, the 1990s, and will again now. Protecting and encouraging and developing Canadian content, the goal of C-11, is a goal supported by artists across Canada. Pierce Henwood, an esteemed musician and music manager working nationally and globally, underlined that C-11 support for me a few months ago. In his summer 2022 Rifflandia magazine article, Creative Courage, he talks of creative courage as, quote, courage to create art, the courage to enter a creative industry, the courage to support a creative economy, and the courage to face social judgment for taking creative risks, end quote. He described music professionals' livelihoods as, quote, the ability to create and then monetize art, noting a melody starts it all, a uniquely mysterious and magical foundation for building a creative economy. The melody cascades outwards to create an economic engine, moving from one head to millions. Agents, managers, record labels, recording engineers, publishers, touring crew, concert and festival promoters, and all media industries. My experience corroborates his. It is the creators who generate content and in turn open doors for myriad professions, together making up a vital economic and social engine for Anglophones, Francophones, Indigenous artists, and those of all diversities. Without artists, there would be no platforms. This bill updates regulations to ensure, as with traditional broadcasters, that the whole sector is fairly treated with artists being paid. As peers emphasized to me, and as our Senate report, Cultural Diplomacy at the Centre Stage of Canada's Foreign Policy pointed out, the benefit and impact of this sector is global. Production and digital presentation on air and online by Canadian artists enriches Canada's perception at home and around the world. That, Senators, should be compensated, just as every industry compensates its innovators. So, colleagues, I truly believe C-11 needs to be passed as quickly as possible. It is only right and fair that the same principles hold for today's new technological platforms as they have with earlier ones. We saw in the early stages of CBC the early commissioning of thousands of commissioned and performed scripts and music scores. Some are in the archives, some not. But even as George Woodcock in his book Strange Bedfellows noted, even the employment provided by the CBC to actors, musicians, and writers assured, in most cases, only part of the money needed to survive. Last June 21, the National Post voiced the question of protecting domestic cultural industries as more Canadians turned to internet companies for music and video programming. And they were concerned about stunting the influence of U.S. culture, a core principle of modern Canadian media law. They noted that for decades the government has required radio and television broadcasters to produce and distribute local content. Hundreds of people I have spoken with, including Robin Sokolowski, Director of Organizational Development at Mass Culture, expressed unwavering support for this bill, for the monies which should be paid for and to the arts, and for the discoverability of art. Ms. Sokolowski told me the bill includes policy objectives needed to ensure that the works of our creators are discoverable. And in this algorithm-driven online world, accountability isn't just a consideration. We need to build in measures that both protect our artists and provide access to their work. Many people also told me the urgent need for the internet platforms to be within the purview of the CRTC. Without the due financial contributions that should be coming, our stories cannot and will not be told. And I contend, colleagues, their telling has never been more important. We must be able to see and hear the Indigenous, Black, and immigrant histories that have never been part of the traditional Canadian histories. Further, it stands to reason if we don't have content creators, we won't have internet platforms. And if that content is not created by and about Canadians, we won't know our country, our stories, places, or ideas. Senator Dawson said in this chamber these policy objectives will ensure that our broadcasting system reflects Canadian society and that diverse and inclusive programming is available to everyone, essential to ensuring the Canadian broadcasting system can help broaden people's perspectives, spur empathy and compassion for others, and celebrate our differences, while strengthening the common bonds that unite our unique Canadian society. Now is not the first nor the last time new technologies have challenged broadcasters. Broadcasting legislation and regulation was addressed by the 1929 Aired Condition, the 1949-51 Massey Commission, the 1981 Applebaum-Hébert Federal Cultural Policy Review, not to mention the Mulroney government's well-handled concerns of Canadian periodicals when negotiating the first Canada-US trade agreement. Today, in 2022, the issue is just as simple and just as complex as former times.
This first modernization of our broadcasting legislation since 1991 actually adds 3 requirements for digital media companies. They must provide information on their revenue sources, donate a portion of their profits to a fund to support Canadian content, and increase the visibility or discoverability of Canadian content.
Canada is not alone. The government has assessed and drawn from policies and actions of other countries, including Britain, Australia, and the European Union. EU local content rules, for instance, require platforms to promote European cultural productions. At least 30% of their catalogues must be made in the bloc. And the EU requires video-on-demand services to prioritize local content. As to freedom of speech, it is not curtailed by this bill. In fact, history has demonstrated many times that no members of society fight more for free speech than artists. Indeed, the foresight and courage of artists and scientists, as I have said in this chamber before, puts lights on issues our society must deal with, including those not always popular or heard, like raising the issues of residential schools and murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls long before the commissions for either were established and long before the concerns were heard by society. Chers collègues,
Colleagues, it is important to know what is really in this bill and not in this bill. We need to update the 1991 legislation and recognize and reflect contemporary technologies. The need to respect and reward Canadian artists is essential, as is the production and presentation of Canadian content, our stories, our issues, and our perspectives.
Canadian stories are told, celebrated, and heard, so their creators and producers are recompensed, and so there are budgets for more stories for the engagement and enjoyment of Canadians. Heaven knows we are in dire need of Canadian truths, insights, and inspirations. Only then will we be able to fully understand who we are and what we need to do to honor our past and vision our futures. This bill provides for that. Without it, I fear we will lose so much about who we are. Without that content, we won't have platforms. Thank you. Merci.